I would like to see real development happen in brown and black communities and people to stop using this term of gentrification as an excuse for making people's lives better.
At Home with Growing Older is a nonprofit organization which believes in peer learning and creating discussions which bring the lens of aging to a variety of topics. At Home with Growing Older is proud to be your host of At Home on Air, a radio hour offering connection, community, and knowledge to our participants remotely. Now, we invite you to listen and learn from this live recorded episode of At Home on Air.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Susie Stadler, an architect by profession and the executive director of At Home with Growing Older. I'm also the producer of this program, At Home on Air. For us, the meaning of being at home is twofold. First, it refers to how we can live and thrive in our home environments. And second, how we can come to feel at home with growing older in our wider communities and within ourselves. Walter Hood is our guest in this episode. Walter Hood is an Oakland, California-based, internationally renowned landscape designer, artist, educator, and MacArthur Fellow. His work is focused on the public realm and urban environments, very, very important contributors to our health and well-being. Many of his projects empower and serve marginalized communities across the country. The spaces he creates entice us to get out of the house and connect with others, making the city a place where we all belong. So welcome, Walter, and thank you so much for your innovative and humanistic work and making time in your very busy schedule.
Thanks for inviting me, Susie. It's really great.
Walter, you have done quite a bit of work in Oakland, the city you have lived in for many years, 25 years, I think, no? That's a long time to partner up with the city to call it home. Since I'm also a lucky Oaklander, I personally benefit from one of the parks you designed when I go there for the busy weekly farmers market. This park called the Splash Pad Park is more than 20 years old. Congratulations. And what's amazing about this park, and a little bit of story behind it, it was a really derelict space adjacent to the 580 freeway. It's now a thriving urban hangout space for all ages, races, and cultures, and it's a happy place. I would love to start the conversation by asking you, what are the ingredients for its lasting success? Not every public space has this staying power. Does the city it's in have to do anything with it? You know, the people, its history, etc.
I wouldn't say I have the answer to what makes a successful place, but the spaces that we make, particularly in the Bay Area, we use the term hybrid. We tend to kind of think about them through their hybrid nature, that we're not trying to take them back to something, but we approach them for what they are. So when we first came to Splash Pad Park, it was a traffic island that they were calling a park. It had a derelict fountain, and it had some really bad park usages that you couldn't do. And it was just not a usable space. It actually turned out that if you didn't want your palm trees, you could give them to the city, and they ended up at Splash Pad Park. On one of our first meetings, we had about 120 people coming, and the project that started it was for actually crosswalks. It was not to redesign the park. They had gotten a transportation grant to actually do bulb outs to connect Grand Lake all the way back to the park. At the first meeting, over 120 people showed up, and there was a contingency that wanted a dog park. There was a contingency that wanted an urban space like Times Square. There was a contingency that wanted to open up the creek. There was all this interest into making public space. And the council person at the time said, Walter, listen to them. I'll come up with the money. This was Danny Wan. And Danny was not seeking re-election. And this was very important. So he basically said, I'll take the bullets for you. And so we then set a process up where we designed the park. And as you look at the park, we tried not to erase its history. So you can still read the splash pad park form. We didn't remove any of the palm trees. Even the road that cut through, we did not change the road. The road is still there. It's just level. We kept the curb and gutters. And what I mean by hybrid is we come in and make a space. We don't erase it to start again. We start from where the space left off. And so I like to think that our spaces have this je ne sais quoi, this quality about it that you can't put your fingers on. And it's because we never erase them. We actually create a palimpsest. So there's something always there that's familiar, but always also new. And that's been a kind of recipe for a lot of our public spaces over the last 25 years. And that's what include locally Lafayette Square. You know, if you go to Lafayette Square today, hopefully Black folk are still there. Hopefully the homeless are using the bathroom, and hopefully it's doing the work that it set out to do 25 years ago. 25 years ago, San Francisco was kicking homeless out, and we decided to care for our homeless here, even though the city didn't want to do it. The Center for Urban Family Life pitched in, and we got nonprofits to help out. So this hybrid approach allows a lot of voices to come in, and you can actually then work. So it's not about going in and scraping a space clean, but how do you continue that legacy of the space into the future?
So this is probably one ingredient that you observe. You don't put a proven concept there, but you observe. When you moved to West Oakland, you started with your urban diaries. I am just curious, our cities have changed a lot. Oakland has changed a lot. How would your observations in an urban diary look today?
I think they would be pretty much the same, at least in my neighborhood. My neighborhood has actually gotten worse, so I'd probably have better stories today about the plight of individuals in the public realm. But, the notion of observing, it's a little different. It's not a behaviorist approach. It's not that I'm looking to look how people are using a space, but kind of keeping a diary is trying to understand what's familiar to people, because I do think when new spaces come into places, they can be alienating if they're not familiar to the group that's there. And some people like to use the term gentrification or whatever, but I like to think that when foreign things come into your life, and particularly if you're in a marginal circumstance, then you're suspect, right? You're like, well, that's not for me because it's not familiar, so therefore maybe I won't use it. But by bringing in these familiar things, we try to make people feel like they're part of the change, that the change is actually coming for them, the improvements are coming for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and helps people to feel at home in the spaces and take ownership. What are your public spaces you go to?
I don't have time to actually hang out in public space. Right now, the biggest public space I use is probably UC Berkeley. I teach a class down at one end of campus, and then I walk all the way to Worcester Hall. So that's my big public space use. Emeryville, Berkeley, Oakland. I'm in this triangle of the three cities. So I kind of move around that area. And where my office is at 30th and San Pablo, that's another area. I tend to not go to parks per se, but just use the urban environment, whether going for a walk or talking to neighbors.
Yeah, so it's more street life than park life.
Yeah.
As you know, I come from Europe. My sort of TV image of America was people sitting on the front porch and waving to their neighbors, which of course is a very suburban kind of image. I practice this in my own home. It feels like some sort of front porch would be a great homemade complement to the truly public spaces. Is there any way people could be encouraged to actually execute them and invite people into this semi-public spaces?
Yeah, I mean, that exists pretty much. Neighborhoods, in this country, they are class-based, right? And again, I live in West Oakland. I go to Berkeley every day, and I literally travel through this, how can I say, I go through these different ecologies every day. In my neighborhood in West Oakland, socialization can happen in cars on the street. A car will stop in the middle of the street and have a conversation with someone and block traffic. But that's just a pattern and practice in the neighborhood. Someone could be on their porch and yelling across to someone else. There are much more idiosyncratic patterns because the landscape is undeveloped. And what I mean by that, the landscapes are bleak. We don't support them through public works. There's no street trees. And so you end up seeing these improvised acts in these places. This is why people don't get out of their cars when they're talking. You don't see that in Hillegas, where I go in Berkeley. It's a complete opposite. People are on the street walking with their kids. At nighttime, I have to cut my high lights on because the foot candles are 0.2 because it's dark. They can see the sky. I get to Oakland, the foot candles are 0.8. And so again, really thinking about from place to place, the patterns in practice are a result of those kinds of conditions. And I think it is a romantic notion to think that everyone is going to have these stereotypical kinds of things, but those conditions are people improvise and they act within what they have. And so I tend to not throw shade on different places that look different than the kind of the normative thing. I want to accept those things and then try to reinforce those things if I have a chance to improve it in some way, right? And so in those undeveloped areas, I would love for places that don't have high biomass to have more biomass so those patterns might change. I would love for the foot candles of lighting to come down to help with the trauma in these neighborhoods. Or in my neighborhood, there's a meat packing place right around the corner in a residential neighborhood. So every morning at 5 o'clock, trucks come in, park. So the noise starts at 5. It's only quiet for 2 hours of the night. And again, we don't think about these kinds of things. I go to my friend's house in Berkeley, starting at 8 o'clock, it's dark, it's quiet, the birds, the chipmunks, I hear everything, and then I can see the skies in the morning. And so these places are different, but we need to understand how these impact, different people's patterns. And I know I kind of went off in a tangent, but
that's a good tangent, because what I hear sort of is that, rather than putting in a new park or something like this, it's more about the smaller interventions where you understand how you can support the local habit and environment, or also more than support, actually, heal it in some way.
There are these basic things that we take for granted. For those of us who are privileged and live in places where we take for granted that we have street trees, we take for granted that we basically control the traffic that comes through our neighborhoods. We actually put in blockades and make people go around. We take for granted that we can have a light assessment district. We take for granted that we can have all of these things because collectively, right, we have the capital and we can pull together to make our environments better. A lot of the people in the city have none of those things, and we're dealing with those. And the first thing then, when people come into the neighborhood, they come in with these normative things like, oh, you need a park. We're like, no, we need some trees. No, we need better public works. No, we need these basic things. And that's just the underdevelopment of these red line brown and black communities over the last 100 years. They were set up and then people just walked away.
So has it improved over your tenure in Oakland?
No, it's gotten worse. This is the worst I've seen the city of Oakland in the 25, 30 years I've been. People have left the city in droves, administratively, budget-wise. Again, you go through all of these things. I call 311 all I can and nothing happens.
So as an Oakland citizen who lives in a green, leafy area, I also see some of the good things which have happened. And again, coming back to the semi-public spaces, like the Oakland Museum has done an amazing job at becoming a public space, and you have been their landscape designer. Can you tell a little bit about how your process has worked there at the museum, or how you connected it to the surroundings?
Well, that's like decades of work. We started with the new director coming in from the Children's Museum in San Francisco and rescuing the museum from the city. And this is what people don't understand by OMCA. It was a city-run museum. It was a public museum. 3 museums came together. And as we know, with most public museums, sustainability becomes a big issue. And Lori was able to get the city to basically lease the museum to her. She has a board to raise money, then to do things. The museum had just fallen into so much disrepair. Again, it was a city building, very little funding. This is a 1968 building, and it was one of the first roof garden buildings. And so not having care for close to 50 years, When we started digging, some of the planters were less than 3 feet deep. And then once we did the research, we found that it was a first. And so everything was a first. So the first set of landscapes actually died. The second set of landscapes came in. UC Berkeley worked with them to develop the dirt, and the dirt was so good that things grew really fast and climaxed out like crazy. We worked on like 5 different categories: how to situate the museum in the city in the museum itself. How do we talk about the gardens? The museum has a lot of art. We found out working with them that they didn't want the art. The art just kind of fell into their hands, that they couldn't curate it. So going through a process, we discovered a lot of things that just kind of was causal, that happened and wasn't planned. We've given the restaurant a separate entry so that if the museum's closed, the restaurant could actually still survive. Their first development, they moved the entry over to Oak on one side, and that didn't work. So we talked about opening the museum up. And this was a big thing, that we cut holes in and opened it up to Lake Merritt, which has changed everything. Opening it up to the lake actually made people more aware, because most people thought you had to pay to go to the museum just to go to the grounds. But the grounds are free. It's just the galleries that you pay for. And so there's a clearer kind of notion there. And so it's been a long battle, but we're 2/3 of the way. I think we've gotten to the 3rd level. We have the 4th and 5th level to finish up.
What's the 4th and 5th level?
Just the planting. I mean, there's so much planting. If you notice now on Oak Street, we've removed all the planting along the edge, and we're now going to seed that up and literally get the dirt ready for the second planting.
So for all non-Oaklanders, the Oakland Museum is right at Lake Merritt, sort of in downtown Oakland, and Lori Fogarty is its director, and it has become a real community space. And the landscape, is an important part of it, and connecting it to Lake Merritt. So I would say, as a counterpoint to what you just said about Oakland, and I know that's a different kind of initiative, but these kind of things happen in Oakland too.
And you have to go to Black Brunch on Sundays. It's pretty awesome. It's like you never see that many Black folk in a civic thing, listen to R&B music, having good brunch, good champagne. It's a very diverse crowd. It's really awesome.
I didn't know about this. I will be there. In our work at Home with Growing Older, we consider the home from the vantage point of use across different ages. And I'm wondering how you think about the use by elders in your designs.
Well, we try to think in all of the work, our users are multi-generational. We want to make sure that when we're designing spaces that we're thinking about this full gamut, because we find that when you have multi-generational groups using, there's this amazing symbiotic relationship between folks and how they use things. People don't feel left out. But again, it's easier when I'm thinking of spaces that we've designed, like museum spaces. I think it becomes harder in public spaces, because when you think about who's using them, like some of the parks that we design in the Bay Area, if it's not close to people, they're probably not coming. One of the things I noticed at Splash Pad is that there is a community around it. So there's a constant engagement with that, where places like Lafayette Square, there's an aging group, but that group is marginalized. And that's the groups that I really care more about. And we're constantly trying to figure out ways to advocate for those groups. As I was telling you earlier, my office is at 30th and San Pablo. And, I've been going down San Pablo the last 25 years, and there's a small park there right at 32nd. If you go by there, there's 2 elderly housing projects there. And over the last 25 years, I've just seen people disappear. And it's a really sad thing. You see them out. And for the first time in my life, I saw my grandfather riding a pedal bike in a basketball jersey. And I don't know if you guys know what I'm getting at. It's like our elderly populations in some places literally have to get around on a pedal bike, which is a small kid's bike. Or even the dignity of clothing in certain places. When you see that, I don't see a future there. And you can literally see that future non-existent in a lot of places. And I think this is one of the things we have completely wrong in the architecture profession, this idea of elderly housing. This idea of putting a prefix in front of housing has gotten us in the place where we are. As soon as you put subsidized, low income, elderly, you've already marginalized them, right? The elderly are not in our lives. We put them in these buildings, on these thoroughfares, and we forget about them. And the only time I see something is when I'm going down San Pablo and there's a fire truck. And I know if a fire truck is parked out in front of one of those buildings, and that's the sad thing, that is a daily thing that we see. I was talking to a nonprofit. I was like, why don't you build elderly housing around our schools? There's a public space there, a track. They have a wonderful swimming pool. All of these things, they make sense, but it's too much work. They would have to work with Oakland School District. They would have to do all these things, and they take the easiest road. I got a parcel in San Pablo. It fits, build it.
My thesis in architecture was called At Home with Growing Old. And one of my sort of theories or hypotheses was that the world has to come to you as you grow older. My idea was that, senior housing would be part of whatever you feel passionate about. There would be senior housing attached to the opera. There would be senior housing attached to the ballpark. So I feel like you're sort of going in a similar direction to looking at housing really connected to our lives and not separated from our lives.
Yeah, I think I read a study maybe a decade or so ago, and it was saying like the best place for seniors are college towns. And I think Charlottesville was like one of the #1 places. Walkable, you got culture, you got young people, you got all the ingredients, right? To have this amazing life. And you would think that when we're building these houses, we're thinking about these communities, these things that are interconnected, but in a way we're actually thinking about them in a disconnected way.
Yes. You're so busy, you probably haven't thought about this, but where are you going to grow old?
I'm growing old now, girl. What do you mean? It's actually as we speak. Oakland is too hard, at least in the place that I am now. I mean, as we were talking earlier, it's just hard living here in Oakland. It's really, really hard. When I was younger, I could do it, but again, noise, getting a good night's sleep and all this stuff, it's just really hard. I don't have the, I don't have the interest to move to a place where people don't look like me. And that's why I live where I live. Those places are few and far between. If I want to go to a place that people don't look like me, it's probably going to be abroad. It's probably going to be in some town that makes wine with a nice view. Right, Claire?
Yeah.
How you doing?
Okay, getting older.
This is one of my mentors, Claire Marcus. When I first came here, I took her 140 class, social factors. Linda Park was the first space I actually sat and watched, along with Zellerbach Plaza in San Francisco. I still remember those two, Claire. They're still my two favorite spaces. So thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, you are the mentor from many of us.
You are listening to At Home on Air. We are now switching to questions by participating audience members in this recorded live episode. If you want a chance to ask your question, visit us at athomewithgrowingolder.org and register for the next live episode.
Yasmin says there was a photo of you sitting on some very cool chairs amongst tall grasses in a wild space. Where is this?
That's a place everyone should go. It's in Charleston, South Carolina. It's the new International African American Museum, a sweetgrass kind of field, which is known for making baskets. It's a funny story that we had these benches and the director was like, we need a bench in that sweetgrass field. So she picks it up and places it there.
Eric asks or comments, there are a lot of examples of racial exclusion from the design process, landscape, and buildings that result in built places that reflect that exclusion. For people with disabilities, although we have the ADA as a baseline for accessible environments, it falls far short of what real people need. What do you see in your projects, both public and private, in terms of inclusion of the voices of people, especially designers with disabilities, in urban projects' initial schematic design phase?
Well, racial exclusion is just part of this American logic. Like, we deal with this duality in this post-colonial landscape that we don't talk about at all. We spent most of the 20th century making two worlds. Even though we're in California, we can't put Jim Crow just on the South. We had exclusionary practices here. We had them upstate, New York, Midwest, or whatever. And so we've done more to actually keep us separate. And I teach a class, and we've been talking about it recently. It's like, what are the things that we've been doing since 1968 that say we want to live together? There's very few things that we've done. From an architectural, from a planning point of view, there's very few things that we've done. We haven't even dismantled the things that we built to keep us apart, right? And we can kind of see those things. We know freeways went where red lines were. We can kind of see that kind of thing happening. I would have to say, though, dealing with the other part of the question, it's been great working for museums as institutions. The museums that we've worked on recently have done more than the actual city has done to actually provide places for people. This is like everything from the Broad Museum down in LA, OMCA, the new De Young placed 2 new gardens out there next to their space. Even when they're not open, they still have use for them. The Cooper Hewitt in New York, we've actually created a new space now for people taking care of the kids, can come there in the morning. So in a way, the museum has created, I think, this vacuum to a certain degree, particularly where there is culture. And what we're finding is we're getting this really wide group of people coming to those spaces because of those amenities. It's less of that in our parks because, again, a lot of cities got rid of parks departments. I mean, Oakland had this amazing parks department. If you guys remember, it was right on Lake Merritt. It's where the restaurant is. That's where the landscape architects were. And they actually cared. They had gardeners. They had this whole idea about living in a landscape. Once you get rid of that, now we have public works. And public works is just about picking up garbage. And so, again, in these places where we have resources, those, I think, are becoming the new kind of public spaces, which gets into this public-private thing, right? Where it's not guaranteed all the time, that space. But even on campus at Cal, I'm blown away by how many people just use Cal as a park, particularly older people. It's one of these things that, again, if you're not moving across the campus, you don't notice it. But now I'm teaching at 8 o'clock in the morning at the other end, and I see this, and it's just this really wonderful thing that we don't see on the other side of campus that's more urban.
Yes. So Diane asks, what do you suggest community members do to conserve their community's histories and the cultural feel?
To not erase things. When it's time for change, to make palimpsests.
Can you explain the word?
Americans, we're like so good at throwing stuff away. It's like, oh, I need a new house. Tear the old one down. Let's build again. Versus saying, okay, how do I add to this thing? And then when I add to it, there's a story in that itself. So the next person coming can be part of that same lineage. The starting over and over again, it's almost like every generation has to start again and again. And the way to look at this is non-red line communities, communities that have always been valued, always have palimpsests. This is one of the things that I see around Berkeley. These communities have been there since 1906, these houses on Hillegas, because they were built right after the earthquake. And people just add to them. They don't tear them down. Behind a lot of these buildings is another layer of density, which we don't see. And now they're zoned single family. But at one point in time, people were able to actually put granny flats in the back of their houses. And a lot of students live back there. So in a way, this idea of changing zoning actually will help preserve things because it gives people that ability to adapt. And when we say no more of this, then we freeze these things. We were trying to start a club once. It was like the 60% club. Every project you start, you had to save 60% of something on the site, which would then force you to have this conversation with either the ground, the vegetation, the building, or something, so that there's always this adaptability that's happening.
That sounds like a great plan. On the other hand, what you said before, we often don't take things away. For instance, again, Oakland, the havoc which the Oakland post office and BART wreaked on West Oakland, which is still a wound, really, it's permanently destroyed this neighborhood. Or the example of the San Francisco freeway, which was destroyed in the earthquake or damaged, and then it was taken away, and it created a completely new zone of public life.
I was not talking about infrastructure. I was talking about things that are valued. Good civic buildings, like we had one of the best train stations that literally terminated the Western terminus. And when it came time to say, do we put money into that or do we go to another place? We chose to go to another place. And you just wonder if the group of people who lived around that old station was different, would we have valued that station and built around that station, which is an iconic station. But instead, we took all the stuff and put it into a bad station in a bad place where no one goes to, which is just like, really, people? And now my students every year, I found this amazing train station. We're going to do this great thing there. I'm like, it's a train station.
Yes, very true. Missed opportunities. Mercedes asks another architect, if you could play developer in your neighborhood or collaborate with an enlightened developer, what type of project spaces might you create, be excited by, in addition to solving some of the existing issues, noise, as you mentioned, though perhaps there might be an integral part of it? I ask this with the fantasy that putting it out there might be able to attract resources and enthusiasm.
That's a good question. Well, I have a project that I did a couple of years ago for MoMA in New York. Now it's in San Francisco. It's called 10 Towers, Black Power. It's a futurist thing of putting 10 high rises on San Pablo between one freeway and the other, and using the 10 tenets from the Black Power program to basically guide each nonprofit. And so I basically placed a tower on top of pre-existing. Most of them were theological, they were religious. Within each one, I'm going to extrude it, and each one is going to have a different mission. So one was education, another, basically dealing with those tenets. That's what I would like to see. I would like to see real development happen in brown and Black communities. And people to stop using this term of gentrification as an excuse for making people's lives better. Again, I've been living in this community for 25 years. Claire, your son, used to live across from me. It's gotten worse in this neighborhood. I mean, basic things we don't have. And we have the highest percentage of nonprofits in our neighborhood. And we have the least amount of social amenities, which to me says there's something wrong with this picture. And when I asked the nun from St. Mary's, I was like, do you want to participate in this tree planting program that we're going to start on the street? She says, if you plant the trees, you'll gentrify the neighborhood. And I said, where do you live? And of course, she doesn't live in Oakland. She lives in the suburbs. So these are the kinds of things, again, the ability to see a group of people in the same light. And I think if you give everybody a beautiful backdrop, we all look beautiful. But if you keep us with the same backdrop, you're going to be terrified of us, and you're never going to want and come and be with us, because you've created a backdrop that basically creates this identity. Du Bois talked about. It's this idea that I now have to live up to this thing that is being represented. But you put anyone in a place that has no trees, bombed out buildings, and you take a picture of them, and they're going to have a characterization of that group of people. So I just want to give good backdrops to people, and good prosceniums for life.
Make the urban environment, turn this into a different backdrop. Part of it is tree planting, as you said. Part of it is turning down the lights.
It's simple things when we think about it. I mean, 25 years ago, we planted 150 purple leaf plum trees in central East Oakland. 100 of those trees are still there. Every year they bloom. Right now they're blooming. So in these people's lives who live in this narrow creek bed in this marginal place, 2 weeks of the year, there's this beautiful thing. And it's wonderful, just those simple acts. And there's not even any sidewalks. We just went and planted the trees. But at least for 4 blocks, there's this beautiful color that happens. And it's just those little things that I think people respond to because they're reflected in them.
I was also just recently in East Oakland because there's this whole initiative you probably know about, the Black Cultural Zone. They just opened a welcome center. I went there and I drove through the neighborhoods of East Oakland, which I don't do that often. It's the same kind of houses as in my neighborhood. Nothing different, lovely little houses, but many of them are not maintained. The street is not maintained in front of them. So I feel like just the simple act of maintenance would make a huge difference.
Yep. But what happens is, in a lot of these places, they're the lowest tax base in the city, just like West Oakland. So when we yell, we're the last persons they respond to. North Oakland gets it all. If you go through North Oakland, it's amazing. It's pretty freaking amazing. Rock Ridge, that's Oakland. And I was telling my council person who's part of that, I was like, why when I drive through there, I don't see bombed out cars. I don't see people sleeping in your same council district. Why is that even possible? And it's because that's where the money is. That's where those taxes are.
So Walter, you do work all over the United States. Is there a city which gets it right?
It's America, come on. 2024 in America. No, the thing that we're finding, we're working right now in Atlanta, we're working in Jacksonville, in Miami, Montgomery, Selma. We're working outside of DC. We're working up in Washington State. And a lot of these are in communities that are going through change. And they're probably more the same than someone's getting it right. It's the same issues, the exact same issues.
Your work is focused on public spaces. That's what your career is in. How do you keep your hope up? Given that things have gotten worse, you can make difference, and you do with specific projects. Do you have any optimism that landscapes can change?
Yeah, I have a lot of optimism. I don't have an optimism towards, looking at projects and architecture and urbanism, but I have optimism for us as a society of what we're trying to do. Because I do think we're still the only place on this planet where this experiment is trying to play out. And this experiment is that of difference. It's one of the few places where you will see that there is we're smorgasbord of people trying to live together. We have these moments where it's like, we're getting it, and then the pendulum swings the other way. And we're at that other way right now. In my life, I've seen the pendulum swing, and that gives me optimism because I don't want to be in a place that's homogenous. I want to be always around difference because to me, difference is the thing that excites me. I don't want to be in a place where people are all the same, always doing the same thing. That's probably one of the reasons why I work in a lot of places as well. But that to me is what's optimistic, is to see that there are these moments when something can happen, and when it happens, it's really wonderful. Like we just finished this museum in Charleston that talks about slavery in Charleston, which is a city that went out of its way to rewrite its story so that slavery was never part of its story for over 100 years. And to see like the Calhoun statue come down, to see all of these things change, this museum now to be there in the same place where the Confederacy is shown, is to be part of that conversation. That to me is very optimistic to a certain degree. Or to be working in communities where people are really fighting to remember certain things. We're working on a lot of projects where these memories are coming back. And that's an optimistic thing, that people are not afraid of those memories anymore. Where I've been told in certain cases, like, Walter, we're not ready for that yet. It seems like people are a little bit more ready for it. Not all the way, but at least there's some hope that people want to be part of these stories. We just got this project at Lincoln Center. This is one of those Moses projects that wiped out all of San Juan Hill and then put up a big wall. We just got hired to tear the wall down. So there are these moments of optimism, but there's also the pessimistic states as well.
Yes. Can you just explain quickly who Moses was?
Oh, Robert Moses? Robert Moses was one of these great planners of New York City who said the freeway doesn't need to go around, we can go right through it. He and Jane Jacobs are two great arguers of time.
You talked about people are less afraid to talk about memories and the past. I was also thinking about Sogorea Te, the Indigenous Land Trust here in Oakland. I feel like a lot has changed also in this regard, that we acknowledge who was there before us. That makes me optimistic too.
Well, if you talk to a lot of natives, they want more. They're like, we don't want acknowledgement, we want our land. And so this is the thing. I appreciate that clarity. I really do. And I think we need to hear that more and more and more, because the acknowledgement is just words, right? And I can't even imagine to be a group of people in a place where all you get is words, where you had land. And if we can't see that side of it, I refuse to even be part of acknowledgements, because I find it highly pastiche. If we really want to have this conversation, that conversation has to somehow be broader, and we have to be more empathetic and giving and willing to have these discussions if we want to have these discussions.
I totally agree, but I do think it's a first step. It can't stop there. Overall, we live in this really scary and exciting time of transition. The same is also true that, and I'm going to lead this back to our mission of At Home with Growing Older, where you have this unprecedented group of older adults. I think that there's also a chance that this can become a movement for change, actually led by older adults who are in a different state of their life. They are not only the keepers of memories, but also they have the time, and this is a precious good these days, to become leaders of movements, getting people out and about and making it as easy as possible to be part of public life, I think is really a crucial thing for success where we're headed.
Yeah, and I think too, though, there have been moments in the history of this country, and it's probably been in our lives, where the kinds of things we're facing now are actually easy compared to things that people in the past had to deal with. And I wish we could be much more cognizant of that to go forward. We're working in Selma right now, and having to see what those had to go through just to get on a ballot, right? And to be in that space. And to me, to think, would I do that? Or I was just in Atlanta working at Emory, and we were at the space with King, and I was looking at this one exhibition about during the civil rights movement. They were actually looking back to the 20s and 30s, and people were saying, but you could get lynched and die if you marched, because they were looking at the previous generation and what they had to go through. And I was like, God, could I be part of that, knowing that? Right? That death was there. And so I think the kinds of things that we're dealing with, our history has shown that there have been groups more resilient and that they were willing to put things on the line. And, I think we're at a point where we should be putting things on the line right now. I don't know if you guys have moved around the Bay Area. It's pretty bad. I mean, it's kind of festering to a certain degree. When is that going to happen collectively, where we're going to say enough is enough? We're at a point where a lot of us are privileged and we don't have to deal with these things. We don't deal with them. It's just simmering right now. And I just think we gotta act in a certain way to save people's lives. So I do think people are dying on the street. I mean, literally right outside my window is probably a 70-year-old white guy living in a car, cooking on the sidewalk. He doesn't even look like me, right? I mean, and he's there and no one cares. It's like people just walk by. No one's caring. And that's when I start to worry. It's okay when he looks like me, I get it. But when he looks like most of you, there's something going on. That empathy is just, we're past that point where we're almost accepting this stuff. And I feel guilty because I have a roof over my head every night I go to bed, and this person's right outside the door. And I feel almost helpless.
Yes, it's a call to action, and it's urgent to be real and to call out what's happening. We are doing this in the next couple of conversations too. I'm talking with Mindy Falilov in April. She's a social psychiatrist, and her work is all about the urban environment and mental health. We'll talk about this. And then we have our Age in the City, which is an in-person event, June 15, which will be a community workshop where we are working on reimagining a relationship to urban land and place for healthy aging and intergenerational connections. And this will be a truly intercultural event. So we're trying to contribute a little bit to making this a better place for people to connect and grow old. And maybe, Walter, by the time you're really at this place. Maybe we have swung it around and you will grow old in Oakland. Who knows?
Who knows? I own enough property in Oakland actually to get out of it. We just bought a new office space on San Pablo at 30th. I don't know why, but I'm a glutton. I talked to my office and we were like, should we move to San Francisco or should we stay here? And overwhelmingly people said, let's stay here. It's one of those things where we're trying to be an example to show others that you don't have to leave these places. And that if you stay, you're not gentrifying it. You're just validating that these are places for people to live. And so hopefully I don't have to put a mural on my building. We're not putting murals. We painted it. We don't have any graffiti. We actually have art display, planted trees. So we're actually trying to say that you don't need all of these kinds of reactive things in the environment to show that we're marginal. We can actually show that we're actually progressing.
Well, thank you for at least investing in Oakland and staying here. And thank you for making time and for speaking your mind. Thank you to all of you for being here.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye, Walter. Thank you.
This episode of At Home on Air was produced by the At Home with Growing Older team. We could not host these conversations without the generosity of our marvelous and passionate guests and hosts. Thank you for sharing your personal and professional insights. Thank you to our live audience for your thoughtful contributions. To subscribe to this podcast and for more information, visit us at athomewithgrowingolder.org. Thank you to our sponsors, Rhoda Goldman Plaza, the jewel of San Francisco's assisted living and memory care communities, and the Walnut Foundation, a San Francisco family foundation. At Home with Growing Older strives to educate, inspire, and connect people across generations and disciplines to re-envision and improve the experiences of later life. Don't forget to subscribe and tune in for the next episode.